A glass desk would really open up this corner once we clear all this old junk out, Julian said, the metal snap of his measuring tape echoing through the silent, wood-paneled study. Arthur Sterling sat in his high-backed leather chair, a man who built a shipping empire that touched every corner of the globe, yet he felt as if he were already a ghost in his own home. He wasn't dead yet, but his eldest son was already redecorating his office as if the funeral had already passed. The empire Arthur had built from torn shoes and big hopes was now being measured for parts by the very people he had sacrificed everything to provide for. Hello, friends, and welcome to our story. Before we continue this tale of a billionaire's ultimate test, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Arthur was 72 years old and exhausted by a question that kept him awake in the quiet hours of the night. Did anyone in this house actually love him, or were they just waiting for his bank account to become an inheritance? He looked at an old, faded photograph of his first wife, Sarah, who had loved him when he was a poor young man with nothing. She had been gone for 20 years, and the warmth she brought to his life had been replaced by the cold, calculating stares of his current family. His second wife, Beatrice, walked into the study, her expensive silk dress rustling as she checked her reflection in a gilded mirror. "Arthur, that donation you made to the children's hospital was a complete waste of family assets," she remarked, her eyes never leaving her own image. To her, the life-saving funds were merely a deduction from the lifestyle she felt she deserved. Standing near her was Elaine, his eldest daughter, who remained glued to her phone, posting selfies to the internet and treating the mansion like a luxury hotel. A sudden, sharp, dizzy spell hit Arthur, making the polished marble floor seem to tilt beneath his feet. He clutched the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white, but Julian didn't even pause his measuring. The son simply looked at his father with a gaze that was more curious about his health status than worried for his life. Later that afternoon, Arthur stood in the shadows of the hallway and overheard the truth that shattered his heart into a million pieces. "The doctor said his heart is a ticking clock. It's finally almost over," Julian whispered to Beatrice with a happy, cold laugh. They weren't mourning a decline, they were celebrating a coming freedom from his rules and his presence. Arthur realized that to them, he was nothing more than an ATM machine that had finally run out of time. He knew then that words were no longer enough to find the truth. He needed to see how they would behave when they thought no one important was watching. Arthur reached for his private phone to call his oldest friend, Dr. Aris, and his most trusted lawyer. He was going to give his family the one thing they wanted most, his death. He would fake his own passing to see who would truly grieve and who would simply start dividing the spoils of his life. The sterling reckoning was about to begin. The air in the grand library felt heavy, not with the scent of old books, but with the weight of a decision that would change the Sterling legacy forever. Arthur Sterling did not sleep that night. Instead, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights and realizing that while he owned the skyline, he didn't even own the loyalty of the people under his own roof. He knew that if he wanted to see the true hearts of his family, he had to stop being a billionaire and start being a memory. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Arthur? There is no turning back once the world believes you are gone," Dr. Aris whispered as he entered through the servants' entrance at 5 a.m. Arthur turned, his face etched with a grim determination. He explained that he needed to know the truth before he died for real, to see if there was even one person who would miss him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. Dr. Aris, a friend of 40 years, saw the deep pain in Arthur's eyes and agreed to help, despite the risks. Next, Arthur summoned his most trusted lawyer, Mr. Vance. While the rest of the house slept, they sat in the shadows of the study, drafting the phantom bankruptcy trail. Like a master architect, Arthur began dismantling his public life on paper. He instructed Vance to move his vast fortune into secret, ironclad accounts that no one, especially not his wife or sons, could access. When the news breaks, I want them to believe there isn't a single penny left for them to fight over, Arthur commanded. By noon, the following day, the first leak hit the business journals. "Sterling shipping on the brink of insolvency," the headlines screamed. Arthur sat in the dining room, pretending to read a newspaper, while he watched the digital world react to his manufactured downfall. The reaction inside the house was immediate and predatory. Instead of rushing to his side to offer support, Julian and Beatrice huddled in corners, their faces pale with a different kind of fear, the fear of losing their status. Arthur watched from the shadows as Julian paced the hallway, already calling his own lawyers to see if he could sue the company to protect his personal allowance. There was no, "How are you, Dad?" or "We'll get through this, Arthur." There was only the cold calculation of vultures watching a dying animal. It was the ultimate betrayal, confirming his worst fears before the test had even fully begun. Later that evening, Dr. Arris returned with a small black case. He showed Arthur a syringe containing a powerful sedative that would slow his heartbeat and breathing to a level that was almost invisible to the naked eye. "You will be able to hear everything, Arthur. Every laugh, every toast, every cruel word. It will be a journey through a living nightmare," Arris warned. Arthur nodded, ready to endure the pain if it meant finding the truth. Finally, Arthur sat down to write one last thing, a letter to his estranged daughter, Clara. Unlike the others, Clara had been cast out years ago because she refused to live a life of shallow greed. He invited her to a final family dinner, though he didn't tell her why. As he sealed the envelope, a single tear escaped his eye. He was about to lose everything he had spent 50 years building just to see who would be left standing by his side when the gold was gone. The stage was set, the shadows were long, and the Sterling reckoning was ready to begin. The dining room of the Sterling mansion was a masterpiece of mahogany and crystal, but tonight the air felt like a tomb. The news of the impending bankruptcy had spread through the house like a poison, and as Arthur sat at the head of the long table, he watched the people he called his family. For 50 years, he had filled their plates with the finest foods, and their lives with every luxury imaginable. Yet tonight, their eyes held no sympathy. Instead, they looked at him with a mixture of resentment and predatory hunger. "Do you have any idea what this does to our standing at the country club, Arthur?" Beatrice snapped, her fork clattering against her fine china with a sharp, ugly sound. She hadn't asked about the stress he was under, or if the company could be saved. Her only concern was the social shame of being married to a man who might no longer be a billionaire. "You built this name into a legend, and now you're letting it rot because you've grown old and soft. You've failed us." Arthur felt a familiar pang in his chest, partly from his actual declining health, but mostly from a heart that was being systematically broken by the woman he had cherished. He looked at Julian, who sat across from him, leaning forward with an intensity that had nothing to do with filial love. Julian didn't offer a hand of support. He pushed a stack of legal documents across the table, nearly knocking over a silver candlestick. "Dad, let's be practical. If the creditors are coming, we need to protect what's left," Julian said, his voice smooth and cold, like a snake sliding through grass. "Sign these power of attorney papers now. I can move the personal assets before the courts freeze everything. It's the only way to save our lifestyle." Arthur looked down at the papers. It wasn't about saving the company. It was about Julian grabbing the keys to the kingdom while he thought his father was too weak to resist. Arthur slowly stood up, his legs feeling heavy. He picked up his wine glass, the liquid shimmering under the giant chandelier. The room went quiet, but it was the silence of vultures waiting for a signal. "A toast," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "To family. We often think that light is what shows us the truth, but I have learned that the darkness is far more honest. A man never truly knows who loves him when he is standing in the sun. He only finds out when the light fades and the gold is gone. I wanted to see who would stay in the shadows with me." Beatrice rolled her eyes, and Julian checked his watch, clearly annoyed by his father's philosophizing. They didn't understand the weight of his words. They didn't see the tears in his eyes as he looked at them one last time. Suddenly, Arthur's hand flew to his chest. His glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor, a sound like a gunshot in the silent room. He let out a choked gasp, his face turning a terrifying shade of grey as he collapsed backward. His heavy leather chair toppled with a thud that shook the floorboards. "Dad!" a voice cried out, but it wasn't Julian or Beatrice. It was the sound of distant panic. Julian stood up, but he didn't rush to his father's side. He looked at the documents on the table, his face twisted with the realization that he hadn't gotten the signature in time. Beatrice stayed in her seat, her hand over her mouth, but her eyes were darting toward the safe in the corner of the room. Minutes later, the heavy front doors burst open. Dr. Aris arrived, his medical bag in hand, his face set in a mask of professional tragedy. He knelt over Arthur's lifeless body while the family stood in a loose circle, their faces showing more inconvenience than grief. Aris checked for a pulse that he had already helped to hide. He looked up at the room, his voice heavy with the words they had been waiting to hear. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Aris whispered, his eyes meeting Julian's cold stare. "He's gone. Arthur Sterling is dead." Inside his frozen body, Arthur heard the collective intake of breath. He heard the clink of a glass as Julian poured himself a drink. The test had reached its most painful stage. He was officially a memory, and now he would truly hear what his family thought of the man who had given them everything. The heavy oak doors of the Sterling mansion had barely latched shut behind the ambulance before the atmosphere of the house shifted from a somber silence to a frenetic, predatory energy. Inside the ambulance, Arthur's lifeless body was being transported to a private clinic under Dr. Aris's watchful eye, but back in the grand dining room, the masks had already begun to slip. Julian didn't even wait to loosen his tie. He walked straight to the mahogany sideboard, his eyes fixed on a dusty bottle of Macallan that Arthur had saved for his 75th birthday. With a sharp, practiced twist, the seal broke. The pop of the cork sounded like a celebratory firework in the quiet room. He poured himself a glass, the $5,000 liquid shimmering under the chandelier that he was already planning to sell. To a long life, or at least the end of a long wait. Julian toasted to the empty chair at the head of the table. He took a deep drink, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across his face. There was no moisture in his eyes, only a sharp, calculating glint. Beatrice was already on her phone, her thumb scrolling rapidly through her contacts. She wasn't calling a priest or a funeral director. "Yes, this is Beatrice Sterling. I need an estate agent at the Elmwood property by tomorrow morning. Discretion is paramount. We need to move the assets before the bankruptcy proceedings reach the public courts." She paced the marble floor, her silk heels clicking like a countdown. To her, Arthur wasn't a husband to be mourned. He was a liability to be liquidated. She looked at the priceless paintings on the walls, not with appreciation, but as price tags that could fund her next decade of luxury. Elaine joined them, her face devoid of the tragic expression she had worn for the paramedics. "Julian, we need to talk about the funeral," she said, grabbing the bottle of scotch and pouring herself a glass. "If the company is truly underwater, we can't afford a spectacle. We should do something small, private, a closed casket. I don't want to spend our remaining inheritance on a gold-plated box for a man who failed his own family." "A closed casket is perfect," Julian agreed, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. "We'll tell the press the shock of the sudden cardiac event was too traumatic to view. It saves us the cost of the embalming and the high-end display." They sat there, the three of them, huddled like vultures around a carcass, arguing over the price of a man's final dignity. They mocked his old-fashioned values, laughing about how they would finally modernize the estate by stripping it to its bones. Meanwhile, miles away in a secure, high-tech clinic, Arthur Sterling lay in a sterile room. The sedative was beginning to wear off, his fingers twitching under the white sheets. Beside his bed, a wall of monitors flickered to life. Dr. Aris had fulfilled the second part of the plan. Hidden cameras, disguised as smoke detectors and security sensors, were broadcasting a live feed of the mansion directly to Arthur's bedside. Arthur watched the screen, his heart feeling as though it were being squeezed by an iron fist. He saw Julian drinking his prized scotch. He heard Beatrice selling his legacy over the phone. He watched his children laugh as they planned the cheapest possible way to put him in the ground. Every cruel word, every greedy giggle, was a needle piercing his soul. He had expected coldness, but this was a carnival of betrayal. He lay there, unable to speak or move yet, but his mind was burning with a cold, righteous fury. He realized that the bankruptcy he had faked was the only thing that had stopped them from truly dancing on his grave. They weren't just waiting for him to die. They were celebrating the fact that they could finally stop pretending to care. As a single tear rolled down his cheek, Arthur made a silent vow. He would give them the funeral they wanted, but the guest of honor was going to have the final word. The atmosphere in the Sterling mansion had turned from a house of mourning into a cold office of liquidation, but that changed when a modest, rusted sedan pulled up to the gates. While Beatrice was busy arguing with estate agents, and Julian was finishing his third glass of expensive scotch, the youngest daughter, Clara, stepped out into the damp evening air. She wasn't wearing designer silk or pearls. She wore a simple black dress she had owned for years, and her eyes were swollen and red from a grief that was entirely real. She walked through the front doors, her footsteps quiet on the marble that her brother was currently measuring for replacement. The moment Julian saw her, his face twisted into a sneer of pure mockery. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," he called out from the sideboard, swirling his drink. "If you're here to beg for a piece of the inheritance, Clara, you're too late. The old man went bankrupt before he kicked the bucket. There's nothing left but debts and the clothes on our backs." Clara stopped, her hand trembling as she clutched a small, worn handbag. She didn't ask about the money or the company. "I don't care about the inheritance, Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to say goodbye to my father. Why didn't you call me? Why did I have to find out from the evening news?" Beatrice walked into the foyer, smoothing her dress with a gesture of cold finality. She looked at Clara not as a daughter, but as a stranger who had overstayed a welcome that had expired years ago. "You chose your path when you walked away from this family's standards, Clara," Beatrice said, her voice like ice. "You're a stranger in this house now. We've already arranged for a closed casket and a private service. There's no room for you here, and certainly no guest room for you to sleep in." Clara looked at her stepmother in disbelief, tears streaming down her face. Despite the cruelty, she reached into her bag and pulled out a set of car keys. "I heard about the bankruptcy. I know things are hard. I'm going to sell my car tomorrow. It's not much, but it can help pay for a proper burial. Dad shouldn't be buried in a cheap box just because the money is gone." Inside the secure clinic, Arthur Sterling sat upright in his bed, his eyes fixed on the high-definition monitors. When he heard Clara offer her only means of transportation to pay for his dignity, His breath hitched. He watched his other children exchange a look of annoyed boredom at her theatrical display of love. His heart, which had been hardened by the betrayal of his wife and sons, felt a sudden, sharp pang of hope. He realized that in his quest to build an empire, he had nearly ignored the only person who actually saw him as a father rather than a bank account. Exhausted and rejected, Clara didn't fight back. She simply asked to be alone with the casket for a few minutes. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively, and Clara retreated to the small, dark chapel at the back of the estate. She knelt beside the empty, polished wood, unaware that a tiny microphone was hidden beneath the velvet lining. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she sobbed into the silence. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I thought you didn't need me because you had everything. I didn't know you were all alone in this big house." She placed a shaky hand on the lid of the casket. "I don't need the shipping lines or the billions. I just wish I could have held your hand one last time and told you that I loved you for being my dad, not for being a billionaire." Arthur watched the screen, tears of relief and regret rolling down his cheeks. He turned to Dr. Aris, his jaw tightening with a newfound purpose. "She's the only one, David. The only one who stayed when the light faded," Arthur whispered. The test had provided the truth, and the reckoning was now inevitable. He wasn't just going to return to his life. He was going to ensure that the daughter who offered her last cent to bury him would be the one to inherit the world he had built. By the next morning, the mood in the Sterling mansion had shifted from a cold office of liquidation to a bustling theatrical stage. Julian, having finished the prized scotch, realized that a cheap private burial would be a missed business opportunity. He knew that the eyes of the city were on the Sterling name and that the stock market would react to his father's passing. To ensure his smooth transition to power, he needed to look like the grieving heir the public expected. He decided that the funeral wouldn't just be a goodbye. It would be a rebranding of the Sterling Empire under his own image. Beatrice, ever the strategist of status, agreed immediately. She spent the morning not in prayer, but with a high-end stylist she had summoned to the estate. "I need to look tragically beautiful, not just sad," she commanded, as she examined various shades of black lace and expensive pearls in the mirror. To her, the funeral was the ultimate social event, a chance to project an image of a dignified, powerful widow who was ready to step into her late husband's shoes. She practiced her expression in the vanity mirror, tilting her head to find the perfect angle of sad eyes and a slight frown that would look best on camera. Meanwhile, Julian was in the library, pacing back and forth as he dictated his eulogy to a nervous assistant. He spoke of Arthur's mentorship and final wish for his firstborn to modernize the company, despite having spent years resenting his father's rules. He was carefully crafting a legacy of lies to ensure the board of directors would have no reason to question his leadership. He even invited business rivals and politicians to the service, viewing the funeral as a prime opportunity to network and secure new funding for the business ideas Arthur had previously rejected. Elaine, the eldest daughter, was equally busy. She moved through the mourning house with her phone held high, capturing grief selfies against the backdrop of the funeral flowers. She posted updates to her thousands of followers, using her father's death as a way to garner sympathy and engagement. "The house feels so empty without him," she typed, while simultaneously picking out a designer outfit that she claimed was Instagram-worthy for a billionaire's daughter. She felt that being seen as sophisticated in her sorrow was more important than the sorrow itself. Unbeknownst to the family, Arthur Sterling was no longer in the secure clinic. With the help of Mr. Vance and Dr. Aris, he had entered the estate through the servants' entrance. Disguised in the simple, stained uniform of the catering staff, with a surgical mask covering half his face, he moved unnoticed through the rooms he had once ruled. Idea 1, Idea 9. He carried trays of appetizers and refilled water glasses, observing his family from just inches away. He watched as his children laughed behind closed doors, only to put on masks of tragic solemnity the moment a photographer or a prestigious guest arrived. As the sun began to set on the eve of the funeral, Arthur stood in the kitchen, his heart hardened into a block of ice. He had seen Julian practicing his fake tears, and Beatrice arguing with the florist over the prestige level of the lilies. He had watched Elaine edit her photos to make her eyes look redder from crying. The test had revealed a level of calculation that went beyond mere greed. It was a total erasure of his humanity. He looked at the guest list Julian had left on the counter, realizing that the family had turned his death into a media circus. He tightened his grip on a silver tray, his resolve now absolute. He would give them the grand spectacle they wanted, but the dead billionaire was about to provide a finale that no one on the guest list would ever forget. The morning of the pre-will reading felt less like a day of mourning and more like the opening of a high-stakes auction. The family gathered in Arthur's study, the very room where Julian had been measuring for new furniture just days ago. Beatrice sat in the center of the leather sofa, her black lace veil pushed back to reveal eyes that were sharp and alert, not red from crying. Julian and Leonard stood on opposite sides of the room, already eyeing the safe behind Arthur's desk, like two wolves deciding how to share a single kill. Mr. Vance, the family lawyer for 30 years, entered the room carrying a heavy briefcase. His face was a mask of professional gloom, but as he looked at the family, he felt a deep sense of disgust. He knew that the man they were mourning was currently standing just outside the door in the hallway, wearing a catering uniform and holding a tray of untouched coffee. Arthur adjusted his surgical mask, his heart thumping against his ribs, as he prepared to watch the second phase of his test, the illusion of poverty. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Vance began, his voice echoing in the silent room. Before the public funeral tomorrow, Arthur requested a private briefing regarding the state of his estate. However, I must warn you, the documents I have recently uncovered paint a very different picture of the Sterling Empire than the one you are accustomed to. Julian stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, a different picture? My father was worth $8 billion. The bankruptcy rumors were just a temporary dip in the shipping market. We all know he had secret reserves." Vance sighed and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them across the mahogany desk. "I'm afraid the dip was actually a canyon, Julian. Between bad offshore investments and a series of massive, undisclosed debts, the Sterling accounts are essentially empty. Once the creditors are finished with the liquidation, there may be only pennies left for the family to divide." The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice's hand flew to her throat, her expensive pearls feeling suddenly like a noose. The tragically beautiful widow mask shattered instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. "Pennies!" she shrieked, standing up so fast her chair nearly toppled. "I spent 20 years with that fossil. I endured his boring stories and his ethical business rules for 20 years. You're telling me I'm going to end up in a suburban townhouse with a budget for groceries?" The room erupted into chaos. Julian turned on his brother, Leonard, his face turning a dark shade of purple. "This is your fault. You were the one handling the internal audits. You must have been siphoning money off the top while Dad wasn't looking." Leonard didn't even pretend to be the quiet son anymore. He stepped into Julian's space, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare point that finger at me. I watched you waste millions on tech startups that were just excuses for you to throw parties in Ibiza. If the money is gone, It's because you bled the company dry before the old man could even die." "I'll sue you both," Beatrice screamed at her own children. "I have a marital right to the primary assets. If there are only crumbs left, I will take every single one before you see a cent." From the back of the room, a small, choked sob broke through the shouting. Everyone turned to look at Clara, who was sitting in the corner, her head bowed. Julian rolled his eyes. "Oh, save the theatrics, Clara. You're the lucky one. You've already been living like a peasant. This doesn't change anything for you." Clara looked up, her eyes brimming with real tears. She looked at Mr. Vance, ignoring the vultures surrounding her. "Mr. Vance, I don't care about the shipping lines or the accounts," she whispered. "If there's nothing left, then so be it. But there was an old Bible my father kept on his nightstand. It has my mother's handwriting in the margins. If the creditors are going to take everything, please, just let me have that. It's the only thing in this house that actually has value to me." Behind the door, Arthur Sterling felt a tear of his own slide down his cheek beneath his mask. He had built a world of gold, only to find that his wife and sons saw him as a bank account that had finally closed. Yet the daughter he had pushed away was the only one who wanted his soul. The Sterling bond hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated under the weight of fake poverty, revealing that without his money, he was a stranger to his own flesh and blood. He gripped the silver tray in his hands, his knuckles turning white. The funeral was tomorrow, and Arthur was ready to give his family the inheritance they truly deserved. The morning of the funeral was draped in a thick, grey mist that seemed to cling to the stone walls of the city cathedral. It was a day designed for the cameras. As Arthur had anticipated, the family had turned his death into a grand theatrical event to salvage their own social standing. Rows of mahogany pews were packed with the city's elite, business rivals, politicians, and socialites who had come to pay respects not to a man, but to a name they hoped to profit from. Beatrice Sterling sat at the very center of the first pew, the picture of a tragically beautiful widow. Her black designer lace veil was perfectly draped, and her pearls caught the dim light of the stained glass windows as she practiced her expression of sad eyes and a slight frown for the photographers lining the back of the room. Beside her, Julian and Leonard sat like statues of granite, their faces set in expressions of somber authority. Julian adjusted the cufflinks on his $5,000 suit, already feeling like the king of an empire he believed was now his to command. To them, this wasn't a burial, it was a rebranding. At the back of the cathedral, sitting in the very last row where the morning light didn't quite reach, was Clara. She wore the same simple, worn black dress she had owned for years. Her shoulders shook with a grief that was entirely real, her eyes red and swollen from nights of genuine mourning. She clutched her mother's old Bible to her chest, the only inheritance she truly valued. She felt invisible among the sea of silk and tailored wool, an outcast in her own father's house, exactly as her family intended her to be. A hush fell over the room as Julian stood and walked toward the pulpit with the practiced, arrogant grace of a man who thought he had already won. He looked out at the sea of faces, his voice steady and resonant as it echoed through the high arches. He spoke of Arthur's mentorship and a final wish that had never been uttered. "My father told me, in his quietest moments, that I was the only one ready to lead this empire into the future," Julian lied, his voice dripping with fake reverence. He was carefully crafting a legacy of lies to ensure the board of directors would have no reason to question his transition to power. From the shadows of the side entrance, a man in a stained catering uniform watched the display through a surgical mask. Arthur Sterling felt a cold, righteous fury burning in his chest as he heard his son spend his life and his reputation before his body was even in the ground. He watched as Elaine, sitting near the front, tilted her phone to capture a grief selfie against the backdrop of the expensive lilies, her mind much on her social media engagement than her father's soul. The spectacle was working perfectly. The world believed the vultures were the rightful heirs. As Julian finished his eulogy and returned to his seat with a satisfied smirk, the priest stepped forward. The room was deathly quiet as the old man looked over the congregation. Arthur Sterling was a man who built much, but a life is measured by more than stone and steel, the priest said softly. Before we proceed to the final blessing, is there anyone else who wishes to offer a tribute to his memory? The family remained still, assuming no one would dare interrupt their carefully managed program. Clara gripped her Bible, her heart pounding, wanting to speak, but feeling the weight of her family's judgment pinning her to the seat. But then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the cathedral didn't just open. They groaned as if yielding to a great force. A figure stepped out from the side hallway, abandoning a silver serving tray that clattered loudly against the stone floor. The man in the catering uniform pulled the mask from his face and began to walk down the center aisle, his footsteps rhythmic and powerful, cutting through the silence like a reckoning. The guest of honor had finally arrived to his own funeral. The sound of the silver serving tray hitting the stone floor was not merely a noise, it was a thunderclap that shattered the carefully constructed theater of the Sterling family's grief. As the man in the stained catering uniform pulled the surgical mask from his face, a collective gasp swept through the cathedral, a sound like a single sharp intake of breath from 300 people. The organist's fingers slipped on the keys, creating a discordant groan that echoed through the high arches, before fading into a silence so absolute you could hear the flickering of the altar candles. Arthur Sterling began to walk. His footsteps were slow, rhythmic, and heavy, with a power that seemed impossible for a man who had been pronounced dead only 48 hours earlier. He did not look like the billionaire the city knew. He was disheveled, his uniform was marked by the labor of the kitchen, and his hair was unkempt. But as he moved down the center of the red carpet, his gaze was like ice, cutting through the rows of socialites and business rivals who sat frozen in their pews. In the front row, the transformation was horrific to witness. Julian, who had just been standing at the pulpit basking in his own lies, felt the blood drain from his face until he was as white as the lilies surrounding his father's empty casket. He gripped the edges of the wooden lectern so hard, his knuckles turned a ghostly ivory, his mouth hanging open, but no sound emerging. He looked like a man watching the floor come up to meet him. Beatrice fared even worse. When her eyes met the steady, unforgiving stare of the husband she had already begun to liquidate, her tragically beautiful mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. She let out a thin, strangled cry before her eyes rolled back into her head, and she fainted directly into her seat, her designer lace veil fluttering over her face like a shroud. Leonard sat rigid, his hands trembling so violently that the business notes he had been scribbling during the service fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves. Only Clara, sitting in the very last row, reacted differently. She stood up, her mother's old Bible clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a hope so fragile she was afraid to breathe it out loud. "Dad," she whispered, the word barely a breath, yet in that silent tomb of a building, it seemed to carry further than any of Julian's shouted lies. Arthur reached the front of the cathedral. He did not look at the casket, nor did he acknowledge the priest who was crossing himself in a daze. He stepped up the 2 stairs to the pulpit and stood directly in front of Julian. For a long, agonizing minute, the father stared at the son. Arthur saw the expensive suit, the $5,000 shoes, and the face of a man who had celebrated his freedom with prized scotch while his father's body was still warm. Without saying a word, Arthur reached out and took the microphone from Julian's shaking hand. The screech of feedback echoed through the hall, making the guests flinch. Arthur leaned into the mic, his voice not the weak rasp of a dying man, but a thundering boom that filled every corner of the sanctuary. "I see you've already spent my life, Julian," Arthur said, his voice dripping with a cold, righteous fire. "I've listened to you measure my office for glass desks, and heard you toast to your freedom from my rules. You spoke of my final wishes, as if you ever paused to ask me what they were." He turned his gaze toward the fainted Beatrice and the cowering Leonard. "You all sat in my house and divided the spoils of a 50-year empire before I was even in the ground. You mocked my memory and calculated the price of a cheap burial to save yourselves a few dollars." The congregation sat in stunned horror as the dead billionaire looked out over the sea of the city's elite. "You came here today to witness a funeral," Arthur announced, his eyes blazing with the truth he had gathered from the shadows. "But this is not my burial. It is the end of the Sterling family as you know it. Now let's talk about my money." Arthur Sterling stood at the pulpit, a man returned from the grave, and raised a single hand toward the back of the cathedral. On the massive screens that usually displayed hymns and scripture, a grainy but clear image flickered to life. The congregation, still reeling from Arthur's physical presence, now turned their eyes to the digital ghost of the man's final hours. The first video was from the hospital, recorded just minutes after Dr. Aris had pronounced him dead. Julian's face filled the screen, twisted into a cold, jubilant laugh that lacked even a shred of grief. "Finally, the old man is gone," Julian's voice thundered through the cathedral speakers, echoing the exact words he had whispered into his phone that night. The guests gasped as they watched Julian pace the hospital hallway, bragging about how he had waited 50 years to finally take control. "No more asking permission," the digital Julian sneered. "The company is ours now. Everything is ours." The real Julian, standing mere feet from the screen, began to shake. "This is a lie! It's been edited! It's AI!" he shouted toward the crowd, his voice cracking with desperation, hoping to sow doubt among the city's elite. But Arthur didn't even look at his son. He simply signaled for the next clip. The scene changed to the Sterling mansion. The hidden cameras Arthur had installed weeks prior captured the family, arriving home from the hospital. There was no prayer, no silence, and no shared tears. Instead, the video showed Julian uncorking the prized scotch and Beatrice pacing the foyer while barking orders into her phone. "I need an estate agent at the Elmwood property by tomorrow morning," her recorded voice commanded. "We need to move the assets before the creditors arrive." The city's elite watched in stunned silence as the grieving widow planned a liquidation of her husband's legacy before he was even buried. Then came the most devastating blow. The footage showed the family gathered in the living room, wine glasses raised high. "To freedom," the recorded Leonard said with a cold smile. "To freedom," Elaine and Beatrice echoed as the crystal glasses clinked together in a celebratory toast to a dead father and husband. Arthur stepped closer to the edge of the pulpit, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. "You toasted to your freedom from my rules," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the cathedral like a blade. "You celebrated the end of my life, as if it were a business victory. You practiced your sad faces in the mirror while counting the millions you thought were left in my accounts." He looked out at the guests, the business rivals who had come to scavenge, and the socialites who had come for the drama. "You all came here today to witness a burial," Arthur announced, But the only thing being buried today is the mask this family has worn for decades. I watched you from the shadows, and I heard every cruel word. I saw your true hearts when you thought the gold was gone, and only poverty remained. In the front row, Beatrice sat with her head bowed, unable to meet the gaze of the husband she had already tried to sell off. Leonard was frozen, his notebook long forgotten on the floor. Only Clara, still standing at the back, looked at her father with tears of relief. She had been the only one who didn't appear in the videos of celebration because she had been the only one truly mourning in the dark. The truth has a way of arriving late, Arthur said, his voice softening just a fraction as he looked toward Clara. But when it arrives, it demands an answer. You spent my life before I was gone. Now I will show you exactly what is left of your inheritance. He turned his gaze to Mr. Vance, the lawyer, who stood ready with a final set of documents that would rewrite the Sterling legacy forever. The silence that followed Arthur Sterling's proclamation was not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary, but the suffocating stillness of a courtroom before a death sentence is read. Arthur looked down from the pulpit at the family he had built his life around, seeing them now for exactly who they were, strangers who shared his name but not his heart. He turned to Mr. Vance, who stepped forward with a thick blue leather folder, the final instrument of the Sterling reckoning. "First," Arthur boomed, his voice echoing off the stained glass, "you should know that Sterling Shipping is not bankrupt. My companies have never been stronger, and my personal fortune remains at $8 billion. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Julian's face, which had been pale with fear, suddenly flushed with a different kind of intensity. Greed. He took a step toward the pulpit, his eyes darting toward the documents. "Dad, thank God!" Julian shouted, trying to force a smile through his panic. We were in shock. We didn't mean anything we said. It was the grief." He reached out a hand, but Arthur recoiled as if from a snake. "I sat in that clinic and watched you toast to your freedom while my body was still warm," Arthur said, his eyes like freezing iron. "The only shock you felt was that the ATM might have run out of cash." Arthur signaled to the back of the room. "Clara, come here." Every head in the cathedral turned. Clara, still clutching her mother's old Bible, walked down the long red aisle. She moved with a quiet dignity that made the designer black lace worn by Beatrice look like cheap rags. When she reached the front, Arthur reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm and full of the love he had withheld for too long. "Mr. Vance, read the amendment," Arthur commanded. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Regarding the primary estate of Arthur Sterling," Vance began, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "To Beatrice Sterling, my wife, you admitted on camera that you married me for status and were waiting for me to become a fossil. Therefore, you are hereby cut off from the primary fortune. According to the prenuptial agreement, you will receive the small suburban house you always called ordinary and an annual allowance of $50,000, enough to live, but never again to rule." Beatrice let out a strangled cry, her pearls trembling as she realized her life of private jets and crystal balls had ended in a cathedral aisle. Vance continued. "To Julian Sterling, for your cruelty and your celebration of my passing, I leave you a trust fund of $1 million. You will receive $20,000 a year until it is gone. You are stripped of your title and your shares in the company. You wanted to be a leader. Now you will learn to be a laborer." Julian's face turned a bruised shade of purple, his fists clenching, but his father's steady gaze pinned him to the floor. "And to Leonard," Arthur interrupted, looking directly at his second son. "I know about the $300,000 you siphoned from the company accounts over the last 2 years. I have the bank records and the transfer receipts in this folder." Leonard's calm mask finally cracked, his eyes darting toward the side exit. "You can either sign your resignation and forfeiture of all assets right now, or you can talk to the detectives waiting in the foyer. The choice is yours." Finally, Arthur looked at Clara, his voice softening until it was thick with emotion. "To my daughter, Clara, who was the only one to offer her last cent to bury me with dignity, I leave everything else. I name her the CEO of the Sterling Empire and the sole heir to my shares and properties." Clara's eyes went wide, her voice a mere whisper. "Dad, I don't want the money. I just wanted you." "That," Arthur said, a single tear finally escaping his eye, "is exactly why it has to be you." He turned back to the crowd, his face set in a mask of finality. "The funeral is over. My life, however, is just beginning. Security, show these people to the door. They are no longer part of this family." As the guards moved in, Arthur walked out of the pulpit, hand in hand with the daughter who had loved him for his soul, while the vultures were left to fight over the scraps of a life they had already tried to sell. 3 months had passed since that reconstructive morning in the city cathedral, and the Sterling mansion felt like a different world. The heavy, suffocating silence of greed had been replaced by a quiet, genuine peace. The mansion was no longer a monument to Arthur's isolation. It had become a home. Every morning, Arthur and Clara sat in the small breakfast room, the one with the most sunlight, and talked about things that had nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices. They talked about books, memories of Clara's mother, and the future they were building together. Arthur's health had improved remarkably, as if the weight of the secrets he had been carrying was the very thing that had been making his heart fail. He realized that for decades he had been afraid to see the truth about his family, but now that the masks were gone, he could finally breathe. He was spending his days teaching Clara everything he knew about the shipping industry, and he was amazed to find that she was a natural leader, far smarter and more compassionate than Julian or Leonard had ever been. The consequences for the rest of the family had been swift and final. Beatrice had moved into the small suburban house Arthur had provided in the amended will. She had tried to hire lawyers to contest the prenuptial agreement, but the video evidence of her celebrating Arthur's death made her case impossible to win in the court of public opinion or law. She lived on her $50,000 allowance, finally understanding what it meant to live the ordinary life she had always looked down upon. Julian and Leonard's downfall was even more dramatic. Julian had taken his small trust fund and tried to launch a new venture, but without his father's name to open doors, he found that the business world had a very short memory for someone known for his cruelty. Leonard, faced with the evidence of his embezzlement, had chosen to leave the city entirely rather than face a prison sentence, disappearing into a life where no one knew his name or his former status. One rainy afternoon, Clara sat with her father in the library, looking over the blueprints for a new project. "Dad, I've been thinking," she said softly. "We have more money than we could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. I want to start a foundation to help families who have been broken apart by poverty, the way I almost was." Arthur looked at his daughter, his eyes welling with a pride he hadn't felt in years. "That is a beautiful idea, Clara. Your mother would have loved it. We shall call it the Sarah Sterling Memorial Foundation." Arthur walked to the window and watched the rain wash over the garden. He thought about the man he had been, a billionaire who thought gold could secure a legacy, and the man he was now. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that money can buy a grand funeral, but it cannot buy a single sincere tear. Real happiness didn't come from the empire he had built, but from the hand of the daughter who had stayed when the light faded. "You know, Clara," Arthur said, turning back to her with a peaceful smile, "I spent 72 years building walls of gold to protect myself, only to find that the only thing that truly mattered was the love I almost threw away. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm. The sterling reckoning was over, and for the first time in his long life, Arthur Sterling wasn't just a billionaire. He was a father who was truly loved for who he was, not for what he possessed. Arthur Sterling's journey reminds us of a fundamental truth that many people forget in the chase for success. We often build walls of gold to protect ourselves, thinking that wealth is the ultimate legacy. But as Arthur discovered, you can buy a grand funeral, but you cannot buy a single sincere tear. True wealth isn't found in a bank account, it's found in the hearts of those who stay when the light fades and the gold is gone. I want to hear from you, my friends. Who was your favorite character in this reckoning? Was it Arthur, for having the courage to face a painful truth? Or was it Clara, whose heart of gold remained untouched by the greed that poisoned her siblings? In my opinion, this story is a mirror for all of us. It is easy to be family when the sun is shining and the bank accounts are full. However, the real test of character happens when you think no one important is watching. Clara showed us that love is not a transaction. It is a decision to be there when someone has nothing left to give. Arthur's choice to reward the only person who saw him as a father, rather than a bank machine, is a victory for justice and human decency. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another tale of truth and transformation. Your support helps us share these vital life lessons with the world. Thank you for being part of our community. This is Mr. Hope, and I will see you in the next story.